Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll discuss critical moments in chess. For somewhat experienced or better players, that's one of the most difficult things to recognize. When is the critical moment in the game? Unlike when you're trying to solve a puzzle or reading a book, it's pretty clear that the whole reason why you see a position in a book of combinations, let's say, or puzzles, because that is the critical moment, and you know that it is white to move and win, or black to move and draw, or something like that. However, the big difference is, during a real tournament game, that you do not have that hint. There's nobody that comes around and tell you that, hey, this is the moment to spend your time because there is a combination coming up, or there is an especially good move coming up. So that means that in a real game situation, your task is a whole lot harder. And the way to get better of getting a sense when that critical moment arrives is by practicing and trying to find the common signs of when that critical moment arrives. That's what I'll try to help you with in this lesson. Let's get to our first critical moment of this lesson. Let's analyze this position, what we see. The first thing to look at is to be aware of the material balance in the position. It's not hard to recognize that while each side has a queen, a rook, and a bishop, black does have an extra pawn. So that means theoretically that it is black who is better, and in fact if it would be black's turn in this position, it would be black who would be playing for the win. However, in this position, it is white's turn. Let's think about possible reasons why this matters and how can white take advantage of it. Couple of things. The first one, and most important, to recognize that black has a weakness of the back rank. What that means is that black does have the 3 pawns in front of his king, so it is only up to the rook on d8 to guard against a checkmate on the 8th rank. And white has 2 potential pieces that may checkmate there, of course the queen and the rook. If it was black's turn right now, black could simply move his h-pawn up to h6, open the little window, so black would no longer be in the danger of the back rank problem. But reality was that it is white's turn, and white can take advantage of this moment. Another couple of elements that may be important are the fact that the black rook and bishop are both on unprotected squares. So potentially they may be a way to either attack 2 of those pieces or combining to attack one of them as well as create a back rank checkmate threat. Also, it's worth noticing, although in this particular position it will not be an important factor, that the black king and the black queen are on the same diagonal. And considering the fact that white does have a light squared bishop on c6, in some imaginary situations there may be a fork if the f7 pawn would move. While this latest element is not playing a major role in this actual position, nevertheless it's better to notice all these things than not to be aware of them. So, as we know, the list of priorities always start with the king, the safety of it, or the lack of the safety of the king, or in this case, the potential for a back rank checkmate. So that's the first type of moves that you need to look for to try to take advantage of that problem that black has. In this situation, white has a very simple but powerful move at his disposal, moving the queen simply to e7. What this move does is, on one hand, simply attack the rook, which at the same time also threatens to move the queen to e8, sacrifice it temporarily, and then checkmate on the following move. So therefore, it's quite clear that this is an extremely powerful move. And for example, if right now the black queen would choose to move to d2, protecting that rook, then the checkmate would indeed arrive in just 2 moves. But what happens if black at this moment moves the rook to f8, protecting the rook and ignoring the threat of queen e8, because if right now the white queen would move still there, it has no real threat. Black could, for example, open up a little window and would be safe. The problem is that white can still get rid of that rook from the 8th rank that guards against the checkmate, namely by sacrificing the queen with a check, forcing black's king to capture it, and then here we are, voila, still the back rank checkmate. So, the important element in this position was to combine 2 things: the black rank weakness in black's position and the rook that was on an unprotected square. Therefore, white could gain time by attacking the unprotected piece, while at the same time bring an additional piece that could aid in the back rank problem solution. Let's move on to a real game this time that was played between Husman and Wells. Again, let's first count the material, see where we stand. Looking at all the pieces other than pawns, you'll notice again that there is a complete balance, each having a queen, rook, bishop, and knight. At the same time, it's not hard to recognize that black has 2 additional pawns than white. White at this moment is threatening checkmating in just 5 moves. Can you figure out what that threat is? It's all forced. If it would be indeed white's turn, white could sacrifice his rook in the corner. For example, if black in this position would try to use the pin by playing knight b4, white would give the rook up, king takes, queen h6 check, king g8, and now the famous discovery check followed by checkmate in just 2 moves. Very elegant. The question is, what should black do against this threat? One of the ideas seems to be interesting is to play bishop to f5, with the idea that if the black bishop would be captured by white's pawn, then all of a sudden the white rook would be falling on h7. And naturally, the white bishop cannot capture the bishop either, because queen takes queen. However, white would save the game again by sacrificing the rook, then getting the queen out of the pin by a check, followed by bishop to f5, renewing a similar threat that we already saw with the bishop h7 check, followed by the bishop g6 check and queen h7, queen f7 checkmate. And after black now plays knight d8, white has at least a draw by simply checking constantly with the bishop back and forth. So here we are at our critical position, and what we need to look for is defense. Black is 2 pawns ahead, but white has a dangerous looking attack because the black king does not have the 3 pawns securely defending the squares around the black king. As we know, when we are ahead in material and our opponent is attacking our king, usually what we're looking to do is try to exchange queens, or at least try to keep away our opponent's queen from our king. And that's of course a big hint in this case. Black should play queen f4, and in fact that's what black played in the actual game. It's true that after the exchange of the queens, black will have triple pawns. However, 2 of them will be extra, and black's advantage will be quite obvious. Naturally, white should do everything they can to keep the queens on the board. White moved the queen to c2, and the black knight came to centralize on d4. White tried to attack from c7, but black had the natural developing move to defend. Now black is threatening with moves such as f5 to disconnect between the white bishop and the white rook on h7. Also, of course, the main threat is, as we'll see, after white's tricky move, bishop g6, which cannot be captured because of the immediate checkmate with the queen, and also it kind of threatens to capture on f7 with either the white rook or bishop. But it's a bit too slow because now, after the black rook appears on c8, the rook will come to c1 with check, and it will be white who gets checkmated first. Therefore, white resigned. So what was the moral of the story in this position? The lesson is that where your king is under serious attack, if you can, look for ways to exchange queens, or at least making sure that your opponent's queen stays as far away from your king as possible. Let's move on to our next example, where it is white's turn. What do we see here? If you look closely, you'll notice that there is a complete material balance, even including all the pawns. At the first sight, it's quite noticeable also that white has a bit more active position, occupying with his rook on the d file, the only open file, having his bishop on c3 well located, eyeing right at the pawn in front of black's king. Also, the white queen is nicely centralized and looking towards black king. And white also has a pawn already on h5, which in fact will become the hero of this position. Nevertheless, the obvious question is, how can white materialize his positional advantage? One of the hints that I suggest you remember is that when you feel that all your pieces are on pretty ideal positions, it's a sign that you may need to look for a concrete combination or for a way how to transform your nice-looking position or strategical advantage for mating attack or other material gain. In this case, the key is to utilize the pawn that's already on h5 and the rook that's behind it. Obviously, that rook only becomes powerful on the h file if the h pawns disappear. And white can take advantage of these ideas by playing knight to g5. That immediately threatens by checkmating on h7 with the queen. But what happens if the black pawn simply captures the knight? Now we'll see the point by advancing the white pawn forward. Now, white simply threatens to capture black's pawn on g7, which would finally open the h-file with all kind of checkmate threats. If black captures the pawn, white would just recapture and then threaten with checkmates with either the rook or the queen. And if black tries to push through, then an elegant checkmate follows by h7. In all reality, black cannot change the expected result of the game here, only may delay the final end by a few additional moves. Let's move on to the next position, position number 4. In this position, it is white's turn again. However, if we look at the material balance, we'll see that it is black who is up a full bishop. When you are having a significant material disadvantage, you should have the state of mind that while you would be looking to take advantage of opportunities if they arise, how to win the game, nevertheless, if the opportunity comes about to save the game and to make a draw, let's say by perpetual checks or stalemate or other means, you should go for it. Also, it's clear in this position that black has his rooks doubled up on the g file that potentially could cause serious danger to white's king as well. The bottom line is, if you can save this game, chances are you should. And here, white has a quite typical combination to force a draw by perpetual checks. Remember that when a king is in the corner and one or both rooks are defending it against the checks, oftentimes there is a way to still achieve a draw by perpetual checks. Look at this pattern. White sacrifices the rook on h7. Black's only move is to recapture, and now giving the correct check on e5 guarantees a draw for white. Because if the rook from g8 blocks, then the check comes from e8, forcing the rook back to the g8 square. And if after rook g8, queen e5, the other rook goes back to g7, then white checks from h5, followed by rook h7, queen e5, and black cannot get out of the checks. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, let's see. We have a queen each, two rooks each, one bishop each, one knight each. White has 5 pawns, black has 6. So black has an extra pawn. However, the important things to notice here are the fact that black has his rook as well as bishop on unprotected squares. Also, white has a well-positioned bishop on b2, aiming right at the g7 square. And now comes the interesting part. If white could combine some of those threats, white may win material. Let's check out, first of all, what would happen if the white queen moves to g5? It seems like mission accomplished. We are threatening to checkmate on g7 and at the same time threatening black's rook. However, oftentimes things are not quite that simple. Like here, black has a natural and good defense by playing f6, not only threatening against the checkmate and guarding the rook, but in fact counterattacking white's queen. Let's go back to the starting position and look for a way to still make this work for white to win material. This is kind of a very interesting idea where white uses a discovery to start with to lure the opponent's bishop onto an unfortunate square. The way to accomplish this is to play g4, opening the third rank to attack the black bishop. And now, after bishop captures pawn, the bishop also sits in that unpleasant situation where now the white queen attacks the rook, threatens checkmate, and the bishop as well. So in this case, when black guards against the checkmate by playing f6, simply queen takes bishop, giving white a significant advantage. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this famous composition by Ring, it's white's turn. White has 3 minor pieces for black's extra queen. Typically, an endgame like this would end in a draw. However, because of the unfortunate positioning of the black king and queen, white is able to force those 2 pieces onto a fork. As usual, try to think and figure out for your own how white can win this game. And the correct solution is playing bishop to e6. Wow, but this bishop can be captured by either piece. Well, that's very true, but either of them would allow a fork to come. If queen takes, knight d4, or if king takes, knight to c7. Okay, so the king will move to e4. And now what? If bishop d5, king will simply move back, so that would not make any real progress. Again, white has a brilliant move to follow. Bishop to c8, simply trying to trap the black queen. Amazingly, even though it seems that there are a number of squares to go to, none of them really work. If queen takes bishop, then the fork comes from d6. If the queen takes the pawn on a4, the fork comes knight c3. And if the queen moves to a8 or c6, then a third move that finally indeed forces the black queen and king onto a forking position. Queen takes and knight d6. What a brilliant endgame. Well, thank you for listening, and hopefully these examples of critical positions and the comments to them will help you to have a better sense when the critical moments arise. As you've seen in these examples, some of the hints may be when you see your opponent's pieces on unprotected squares. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week. Bye-bye.